The gut microbiome might be the most underrated system in your entire body. It's not just about digestion. Right now, trillions of bacteria in your intestine are producing compounds that regulate your metabolism, training your immune system, manufacturing neurotransmitter precursors that affect your mood, and maintaining the barrier that prevents chronic inflammation from spreading throughout your bloodstream. When this system is healthy, it supports everything else. When it's dysbiotic or out of balance, it creates metabolic dysfunction, immune problems, and inflammation that ripple into virtually every aspect of your health. And the research on this has been absolutely overwhelming in the last 10 years or so. My name's Dr. Alex, and over the last few years working in emergency medicine, I've become fascinated by the habits that separate people who age well from those who don't. And in my last video, we covered the warning signs of a poor gut microbiome. This one is about fixing it. 9 evidence-based ways to improve your microbiome. No supplements, no extremes, just habits backed by solid research. Before we jump in, let me just clarify quickly what we're actually aiming for. Improving the microbiome means increasing microbial diversity, the number of different bacterial species in your gut. Higher diversity correlates with better health outcomes, virtually across every metric. It also means supporting beneficial metabolic outputs, particularly short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which reduce inflammation and strengthen your gut barrier. And it means reducing inflammatory signaling from dysbiotic bacteria. Now, the good news is that most of these changes come from environment and behavior, not genetics. Your microbiome is remarkably responsive to what you do every day. So let's talk about how to use that control effectively. The first habit is probably the most important one. It's really simple in concept, but it requires some focus in practice. This is eat for diversity, not perfection. Microbial diversity responds to variety in your diet, not restriction. The research on this is remarkably consistent. Studies comparing people who eat a wide range of plant foods to those who eat a narrow, repetitive diet show dramatic differences in gut diversity. There's a concept that gained traction in the research all about eating 30 different plant foods per week. Now, this isn't a magic number, but it's a useful target because it forces variety. What happens mechanistically is that different bacterial species thrive on different types of fibre and plant compounds. Some bacteria specialise in breaking down the fibres in legumes. Others prefer the resistant starch in cooked and cooled potatoes or rice. Others thrive on the polyphenols in berries or the sulfur compounds in cruciferous vegetables. When you eat the same 5 or 6 foods repeatedly, you're only feeding a narrow subset of your microbiome. When you introduce variety, you create niches for many different species to flourish. The practical takeaway for this section is to stop thinking about the perfect diet and start thinking about rotation. If you always eat spinach, then try kale or rocket. If you always have rice, then try quinoa or barley. If you always snack on almonds, then try walnuts, which are really, really good for you, or pumpkin seeds. Small substitutions add up to major increases in diversity over time. What I've noticed personally is that when I consciously rotate my vegetables and my grains, I feel more satisfied and less prone to cravings. It sounds odd, but it's true for me. There's something about nutrient and fibre variety that creates a deeper sense of satiety than eating large amounts of the same food repeatedly. Moving on to the second habit, and we need to talk about fibre, but not in the way that most people think about it. So fibre isn't just about digestion or regularity. It's literally fuel for your microbiome. Specifically, we're talking about prebiotic fibres, the types of fibre that resist digestion in your small intestine and reach your colon further down intact, where bacteria can ferment them. The best sources of prebiotic fibre are legumes like lentils, chickpeas and beans. or whole grains like oats, barley and rye, or vegetables like onions, garlic, leeks, and asparagus, and then the obvious things like nuts and seeds. These foods contain fibres that beneficial bacteria can break down into short-chain fatty acids. Now, why this matters goes back to what these short-chain fatty acids actually do. Butyrate, for example, which I mentioned in the previous video, is the primary fuel source for the cells lining your colon. It strengthens the gut barrier, it reduces inflammation, and has actually been shown to improve insulin sensitivity. Acetate and propionate also have anti-inflammatory effects and influence metabolic signaling throughout the body. When you don't eat enough prebiotic fibre, beneficial bacteria starve. They can't produce these protective compounds. Opportunistic bacteria that thrive on simple sugars and amino acids from protein digestion then take over. The metabolic output of your microbiome shifts from anti-inflammatory to pro-inflammatory. And the research on fibre intake and health outcomes is staggering. Higher fibre intake is associated with the lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, colorectal cancer, and all-cause mortality. Some of this is direct. We know that fibre affects cholesterol and glucose metabolism, but much of it is mediated through the microbiome and the compounds that it produces. The practical goal is to aim for at least 25 to 30 grams of fibre per day, ideally from diverse sources. What most people in Western countries get is less than 15 grams. And that gap represents a massive missed opportunity for microbiome health, and it's really easy to tick off. The third habit is incorporating fermented foods into your diet, things like kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, or miso. These foods contain live bacteria that can temporarily colonize your gut or interact with your existing microbiome in really beneficial ways. The evidence on fermented foods has strengthened considerably in recent years. A randomized controlled trial published in Cell showed that people who consumed fermented foods daily for 10 weeks had significant increases in microbial diversity and reductions in inflammatory markers compared to those who just increased their fibre intake. Both groups improved, but the fermented food group showed unique benefits. The mechanism here isn't about permeability adding huge populations of new bacteria. Most bacteria from fermented foods pass through without colonizing long term, but their presence while they're in your gut influences the existing community. They produce compounds that feed beneficial resident bacteria. They compete with opportunistic species. They modulate immune responses in the gut lining. The important nuance here is that consistency matters more than volume. You don't need to eat massive amounts of kimchi or sauerkraut or drink litres of kefir. Small, regular exposure is more effective than occasional large doses. A few tablespoons of sauerkraut with a meal or a cup of kefir as a snack, these are enough to create beneficial effects over time. What I find really useful about fermented foods is that they add a lot of flavour and a lot of variety to meals without requiring elaborate preparation. Things like kimchi on rice or sauerkraut on a sandwich, kefir in a smoothie, these are all simple additions that I do that compound into meaningful microbiome benefits. Now we come to a habit that bridges nutrition and movement, and it's one of the most underappreciated strategies for gut health. And this is walking after meals. This isn't primarily about burning calories or getting your steps in, it's about creating a stable metabolic environment that supports a healthy microbiome. When you eat, your blood glucose rises. If you sit still afterwards, that glucose stays elevated longer and peaks higher. Higher glucose levels alters the pH and the availability of nutrients in ways that favour opportunistic dysbiotic bacteria over the beneficial species. Walking after meals pulls glucose out of your bloodstream through muscle contraction. Your blood sugar rises less dramatically and returns to baseline faster, which creates a calmer, more stable metabolic environment. The bacteria in your gut are sensitive to these fluctuations. When glucose is stable, beneficial bacteria that produce these short-chain fatty acids thrive more often. When glucose is volatile, bacteria that thrive on high sugar environments dominate. The research on post-meal walking shows improvements in glucose control, insulin resistance, and inflammatory markers, but the microbiome connection is only recently being explored. Studies are starting to show that people with stable glucose patterns have more diverse microbiomes and higher levels of beneficial bacterial species. And the practical application is really simple. After meals, especially lunch and dinner, just walk for 10 or 30 minutes. You don't need intensity, just gentle movement is fine. And what this habit does is stabilises your blood sugar. It supports your microbiome, and as a bonus, it improves your sleep and reduces your cravings through other mechanisms that we've covered in previous videos. Moving on to the fifth habit, we need to talk about something that most people don't associate with gut health at all, which is your circadian rhythm. Well, it turns out that gut bacteria follow daily cycles. Their activity, their metabolic output, even their location within the gut fluctuates based on the time of day. When your sleep-wake cycle is consistent and aligned with natural light patterns, your microbiome operates optimally. The bacteria know when to expect food, they know when to ramp up metabolic activity and when to rest. This coordination supports both microbial diversity and beneficial metabolic outputs. But when your circadian rhythm is disrupted through shift work, through chronic sleep deprivation, through late night eating, or just irregular sleep schedules, your microbiome becomes dysregulated. Studies on shift workers and people with chronic jet lag show reduced microbial diversity and increased populations of inflammatory bacterial species. The mechanism involves hormones like cortisol and melatonin, which fluctuate predictably throughout the day when your rhythm is stable. These hormones influence gut motility, immune signaling in the gut lining, and the metabolic activity of these bacteria. When hormone patterns become erratic, the microbiome loses its temporal structure. Late night eating is particularly problematic because it forces your gut to process food at a time when it's supposed to be in a fasting repair state. It creates this metabolic confusion and favours bacteria that thrive in constant nutrient availability rather than those adapted to cyclical feeding patterns. The practical levers here are consistent sleep times, even on weekends, avoiding food for at least 2 to 3 hours before bed, getting bright light exposure in the morning, and dimming lights in the evening. What these habits do are synchronise your circadian rhythm and your microbiome benefits downstream. The sixth habit is reducing ultra-processed foods, and the reason has less to do with individual nutrients and more to do with what these foods do to your gut environment over time. Ultra-processed foods are typically low in fermentable fibre, high in rapidly absorbed sugars, and packed with additives like emulsifiers and artificial sweeteners that directly affect the microbiome. Emulsifiers added to improve texture and shelf life have been shown in both animal and human studies to disrupt the protective mucus layer lining the gut, allowing bacteria to come into closer contact with intestinal cells. What they do is trigger inflammation and increase gut permeability. Artificial sweeteners, once thought to be metabolically inert, also alter microbial composition in ways that can worsen glucose tolerance. At the same time, ultra-processed foods lack the diversity of fibres and plant compounds that beneficial bacteria need to thrive. When these types of foods dominate your diet, you're effectively starving protective species while favouring bacteria linked to inflammation. Again and again, higher ultra-processed food intake is associated with lower microbial diversity, higher rates of inflammatory bowel disease, and worse metabolic health even after accounting for calorie intake and your body weight. The key point here isn't fear or restriction, but replacement. When whole foods crowd out ultra-processed ones, the microbiome is given the raw materials that it needs to stabilise and recover. Moving on to habit number 7, and this one is all about psychological stress, because the gut-brain axis works in both directions. Your gut influences your brain, but your brain also powerfully shapes your gut. What we know is that chronic stress creates measurable changes in the microbiome through sustained release of cortisol and adrenaline, hormones that slow gut motility, reduce blood flow to the intestine, loosen the tight junctions between intestinal cells, and increase gut permeability. This environment favours inflammatory bacteria and makes it much harder for beneficial species to survive. Studies consistently show that people under chronic stress have lower microbial diversity, they have higher levels of inflammatory species, and fewer bacteria involved in producing calming neurotransmitter precursors. Now, over time, this creates a vicious cycle. Stress disrupts the microbiome, the altered microbiome produces inflammatory signals that affect the brain, and stress sensitivity increases even further. Breaking that cycle doesn't mean eliminating stress, which obviously isn't realistic. It means preventing stress from becoming chronic and unmanaged. Things that can help are walking, deep breathing, time outdoors, and social connection. They all measurably lower your baseline stress hormones and allow gut function to normalise. When stress is intermittent, followed by recovery, the microbiome adapts. But when it's constant, the damage accumulates. The eighth habit is really important to me as a doctor, and it's being thoughtful about antibiotic use. Antibiotics are life-saving drugs, and when they're genuinely needed, they save lives. But they also have profound and often long-lasting effects on the microbiome that need to be understood. Broad-spectrum antibiotics like coamoxiclav or tazocin don't distinguish between harmful and beneficial bacteria, leading to dramatic reductions in microbial diversity. Studies tracking people before and after antibiotic courses show that some species disappear entirely, while others may take months to recover, if they ever recover at all. The microbiome that grows back is often less diverse and more vulnerable to colonization by opportunistic pathogens, which helps to explain why repeated antibiotic exposure is linked to recurrent infections, chronic digestive symptoms, and increased metabolic and immune dysfunction. The goal here isn't avoidance at all costs. If you have a serious bacterial infection, then antibiotics could be essential. The goal is just appropriate use, not taking antibiotics for viral illnesses, not using them for minor self-limiting problems, and not taking them without clear indication. When antibiotics are necessary, supporting recovery afterward becomes important. And the most effective way to do that is through your diet. Fibre-rich whole foods and fermented foods help to create the conditions that allow beneficial species to recolonize naturally. And finally, we come to the ninth habit, which really ties everything together, and that's playing the long game. The microbiome doesn't respond well to intensity or short-term extremes. It responds to consistency. Gut bacteria adapt over weeks and months, not days. Sudden, dramatic dietary changes can overwhelm the system. Cycling between restriction and indulgence repeatedly disrupts microbial communities. And trying to optimize everything at once often creates stress that backfires. Research on microbiome interventions shows that modest changes sustained over time lead to far greater and more durable improvements than extreme short-lived efforts. Gradually increasing your fibre intake works better than sudden spikes that cause bloating and discomfort. Regular inclusion of fermented foods produces more benefit than short bursts followed by long gaps. This is good news because it means that perfection isn't required. You don't need rigid rules or expensive supplements. You need reasonably good choices made consistently. Over time, those choices compound and create an environment where a healthy microbiome can flourish. So let's bring this full circle. Improving your gut microbiome isn't mysterious or complicated. It just comes down to a small number of principles applied consistently over time. And those are eating diverse, including fibre-rich whole foods, including fermented foods in your diet regularly, moving your bodies in a way that support your metabolism and stress regulation, protecting sleep and circadian rhythm, reducing ultra-processed foods, managing stress, being thoughtful with antibiotics, and most importantly, playing the long game. These habits don't just affect the gut in isolation, they influence your metabolism, your immune function, your inflammation levels, your mood, your cognition, and your long-term disease risk. It's about how small, daily decisions quietly compound into entirely different health outcomes over years and decades. And that's exactly what this whole channel is about. Thank you so much for watching until the end of this video. And if you did get some value from it, then please hit the subscribe button, because it really does help this channel grow and reach more people like you.